Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a place where curiosity settles in like a warm blanket and science drifts along the soft edges of imagination. Tonight, we're going to roam a little farther than we usually do, not only through the woods of history or the starfields of physics, but into the hazy space in between, a place where memory and mystery overlap, and where the human story might not start exactly where we've always assumed it does. Because the question before us tonight isn't really about our destination, but about who might have traveled this path ahead of us. What if the very first civilization didn't crumble into legend or rubble, but simply departed? What if, ages before the earliest pyramids, before controlled fire or written words or cities, someone else stood beneath this same night sky and decided to leave Earth behind? Before we go searching for them, I'd like to know something small and personal. Where are you listening from right now? Maybe you're tucked away somewhere quiet where the hum of evening feels old, almost ancient. Maybe you're in the middle of a city wrapped in neon and electricity instead of starlight. Either way, this moment is yours. And so is the question we're about to gently unfold. If you find rest in this kind of wondering, if letting your mind float through impossible ideas helps you soften into sleep, I'd be deeply thankful if you gave this little corner of the internet a like, or maybe subscribed, so that other curious souls might eventually drift this way as well. Now get comfortable. Let your thoughts slow down. We're not in a hurry, because the idea of a civilization that left Earth isn't a tale of extraterrestrials arriving here. It's a quieter, stranger possibility that once, long ago, we were the ones who left. When we think about our species beginning, we usually picture familiar scenes. Firelight dancing on cave walls, stone tools tapping and scraping against harder rock, bare footprints pressed into the mud along ancient riverbanks. But what if those scenes are not the opening chapter, but the second one? Imagine that far before all that, there was an earlier rise, a civilization so remote in time that it slipped completely out of our species' remembered story. Not Atlantis or a simple golden age in the usual mythical sense, but a truly primordial people who pushed this world to its limits and then chose to step beyond it. It's an unsettling idea because we define civilization by what survives. Collapsed temples, broken ceramics, symbols etched into stone. Yet if a culture grew advanced enough to actually leave Earth, the main evidence they leave behind might be nothing at all. They'd take their knowledge with them, their instruments, their art, their charts of the sky, leaving behind only an absence, a ghost of where they once were. Geological time would keep turning. Glaciers would advance and melt away. Continents would drift. Anything they built that remained on the surface would erode to powder or vanish beneath the ocean. If they departed early enough, even the crust of the planet could have shifted and folded until their story was fully rewritten. Now and then, when archaeologists dig up something that seems a little too sophisticated for the era it's dated to, people jump to images of vanished kingdoms or visiting aliens. But what if those glimpses of the impossible, the polished metallic spheres dug out of deeply ancient rock, the odd patterns that appear to predate our timeline of civilization, are simply leftovers from an older version of ourselves? A civilization so far removed from us that it never shows up in any surviving legend because it existed before mythology itself was born. If that sounds far-fetched, it helps to remember how much of Earth's timeline is blank to us. Our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for at least 300,000 years, maybe longer. What we call civilization farming, written language, complex cities, accounts for only the last 6,000 or so. That leaves hundreds of thousands of years, where we were physically just like modern humans, but culturally almost invisible. Long enough for a rise and fall not just once, but potentially many times over. And even then, civilization doesn't have to mean skyscrapers or communication satellites. It could have taken a path utterly unlike our own. Technologies that whispered instead of roared. Architecture grown organically rather than carved. Methods of living and building that didn't gouge the planet in the way ours clearly does. If they learn to use forms of energy or matter we haven't discovered yet, their fingerprints might not survive erosion, subduction, or the slow grind of tectonic plates. Their cities might have been fashioned from materials designed to dissolve themselves. Their information might have been stored in forms we wouldn't even recognize as data. As the saying goes, a lack of evidence is not the same as evidence of lack, especially on a world that's so incredibly good at wiping its own slate clean. Picture, just for a moment, the close of the last ice age. Massive glaciers shrinking back, ocean levels rising, weather shifting faster than plants and animals could fully adapt. For a civilization living then, one capable of thinking not in years, but in geological scales, Earth might not have felt stable at all. Maybe they saw the changes coming long before they peaked, and chose to move on instead of waiting for disaster to overtake them. Maybe they had the ability to leave. How would they have done it? Probably not with chemical rockets like ours. Our mental picture of spaceflight is tied to the tools we've built. Metal hulls, trembling engines, violent heat. But an earlier technological lineage might have approached the problem from a completely different angle, discovering ways to move through space using the universe's own forces. Electromagnetism, subtle manipulations of gravity, or something stranger still? They might have figured out how to bend or fold space so the distance between places shrank instead of needing to be crossed. To us, that reads like science fiction. But electricity would have sounded like sorcery to a farmer in the Middle Ages. Antibiotics would have been indistinguishable from miracles to a healer in the Bronze Age. Every era has its own kind of magic, and over time, every magic becomes ordinary. And maybe they didn't travel very far, at least not at first. The moon is our ancient companion, bright enough to see, yet far enough away to disappear into. Airless, soundless, and almost perfectly preserved. A culture that left Earth 100,000 years ago could easily have put something there. A station, a library, a quiet outpost untouched by atmosphere or weather. Our modern lunar exploration has barely brushed its surface. Vast regions remain unsurveyed. If anything of theirs is there, it could still be resting under a shallow blanket of dust, hidden beneath the slow, steady drizzle of micrometeorites. The same questions hang over Mars. Its dry riverbeds, the chemical fingerprints of ancient water, its puzzling magnetic oddities, they all invite another possibility. We search that planet for fossil microbes. Maybe we should also be searching for footprints of migration. When a species leaves its homeworld, it might not abandon it completely. It could scatter instead like seeds in the wind, some staying rooted, others drifting outward. And as that scattering spreads out across time, memory starts to thin. The idea that we might be the descendants of such travelers isn't quite as wild as it appears. Evolution doesn't erase identity overnight. If even a small remnant of that people stayed behind stranded or simply choosing to remain, then within a few thousand years, their descendants could easily have lost any concrete knowledge of their origins. Without written language, without complex machines, the memory of events transforms first into stories, then into myth. Myths harden into religion. Religion erodes into folklore. Folklore finally into silence. Maybe our most ancient tales of beings descending from or returning to the sky aren't about outsiders visiting us at all. Maybe they're about our own ancestors, leaving, checking in, or simply being misremembered across unimaginable spans of time. Some of the oldest myths humans still tell, from Sumerian legends of sky-born gods, to Hopi stories of people journeying through different worlds, share gently uncanny echoes. They speak of cycles of making and unmaking, of knowledge gifted and then withdrawn, of strangers rising or falling from the heavens. It could all be coincidence, or the natural overlap of human storytelling, or it might be the dim afterimage of something that truly occurred. If we follow that afterimage, another question appears. Why would a civilization go at all? Survival is the easy answer. The end of an ice age, a looming asteroid, a chain of volcanic winters. But curiosity could be just as powerful. The same drive that leads us to launch probes to the edge of our own solar system might have pushed them. Maybe they didn't run. Maybe they simply wanted to see what lay beyond their sky. For them, the night above might have looked less like a ceiling and more like an ocean, and Earth just a single beautiful shore. If they went, where could they have ended up? The nearest stars feel impossibly far by our current standards, but that might not have intimidated them. A slow-moving generational ship, drifting steadily across millennia, could cross interstellar gulfs if time weren't a constraint. Maybe they mastered the art of sleeping between suns, letting centuries slip by like a few calm breaths. They could still be out there right now, adrift and dreaming, waiting to awaken when certain alignments or markers tell them it's time. There's an odd comfort in entertaining the idea that we're not the first intelligent culture this planet has nurtured. It shifts our self-image from final product to one moment in a very long chain. Progress, as we experience it, might not be a straight climb upward at all. It could be old instincts resurfacing, ancient habits returning. When we design engines, launch rockets, or map constellations, maybe we're reenacting something deeply buried in us, an ancestral pull toward a home we no longer consciously remember. And if they did manage to leave, perhaps they didn't turn their backs on this world completely. Maybe they left watchers, autonomous systems, monitoring stations, slow repairing machines tucked into the asteroid belt or circling out beyond Pluto's orbit. Quiet devices, built to keep an eye on their birthplace, to see whether Earth would one day produce minds capable of wondering again. We scan the sky for signs of life, but maybe we're also under observation for signs that we're starting to remember. The scale of deep time makes it all too easy to underestimate how thoroughly the past can vanish. 100,000 years is enough for new mountains to rise and wear down, for shorelines to redraw themselves entirely, for continents to drift miles apart. The whole of recorded human history is a flash by comparison. So if there really was a civilization before ours that reached for the stars and made it there, we'd never detect them by bone or pottery alone. We'd have to search for more delicate markers, unusual isotope ratios, strange metals locked into ancient sediment, radiation patterns that don't match ordinary decay, tiny, stubborn fingerprints of something that shouldn't exist. Now and then we stumble across oddities. Mineral formations once thought to be purely natural have turned out to contain structures that resemble manufactured ones. In South Africa, there are metallic spheres dated to billions of years ago, far too old to be human-made, yet almost perfectly shaped. They're probably natural, but they remind us how thin our understanding of the deep Earth really is. If even 1 in 1,000 of these anomalies were truly artificial, would we recognize it? Or would we wave it away as a quirk of geology simply because the alternative feels too unsettling? Even our best archaeology skims only the uppermost skin of the planet. The deeper layers, far below what our shovels and drills can easily reach, could hide the crushed, folded remnants of something ancient flattened by time, heat, and pressure until all obvious form is gone. And still, something inside us keeps searching. We probe Mars for signs of bygone life. We send orbiting mirrors to gather the faintest light from unfathomable distances. We keep our radio ears open, always listening for the slightest whisper. Maybe that urge itself is the oldest clue we have. The compulsion to seek might be our most ancient inheritance. If that first civilization did leave Earth, their exit probably wasn't dramatic. No farewell transmission broadcast across the sky, no world-spanning monument engraved with final words. More likely, it would have been quiet, careful, even gentle. Like flocks of birds shifting direction when the season changes, they would simply have risen and gone. And as the last of their vessels slipped out of orbit, the Earth would have continued to spin below calm, unaware, readying itself for whatever came next. In time, something did. After countless generations, new minds stirred again. Fire was rediscovered. Language blossomed. Once more, eyes turned upward toward the stars. Maybe somewhere out there, those earlier travelers noticed. Maybe they marked our reappearance the way we mark the return of a long-period comet. Perhaps they smiled if they still have anything like faces and murmured, "They're awake again." The image isn't frightening, it feels oddly soothing. Because if they're still out there, they might not be strangers at all. They might be family. And if they once left this planet, Maybe they did it not as conquerors abandoning a used-up world, but as caretakers stepping away, trusting that life would return after them. If you've ever stared up at a clear night sky and felt a strange flicker of recognition, a bittersweet pull toward places you've never visited, maybe that sensation isn't just fantasy. Maybe it's a memory hidden deep in the quiet corners of the mind, where history and folklore blur together. Maybe on some buried level we all remember leaving, and if that's the case, then every telescope we assemble, every probe we send outward, every signal we beam into the darkness is not a first greeting. It's a call to come home, a message from a civilization that once set sail, lost its map, and has been trying to find the way back ever since. It might be that we are their echo, finally circling around. Let's sit with that for a little while longer before we step into the next part of this journey, where we'll search for marks, legends, and quiet clues that might have been left behind, hidden in plain sight, just beneath the surface of our own world. Imagine waking in the middle of the night and catching the faintest sound, distant, rhythmic, strangely familiar. A pattern you can't quite name, but somehow recognize. That's what the deep past can feel like when we stare at it for too long. Not a clean story with a clear opening and neat ending, but an echo repeating through different eras, different landscapes, different lives. Civilizations rise, collapse, and scatter. Apps. Yet some part of them always seems to reappear in the world, whispering that what we call history might only be the thin surface of something far older and far more cyclical than we usually admit. When people speak of lost ages, they almost always mean buried empires, cities swallowed by deserts, kingdoms drowned by seas. The very word lost carries a kind of finality, as if once something disappears, it's gone beyond all reach. But Earth is rarely that absolute. It doesn't obliterate everything. It buries, folds, remakes. The traces of what came before are rarely wiped away. They're layered. Every stone we flip over, every artifact we lift out of the ground belongs to that layering. A physical memory of something that once was real. What's harder to grasp is how much of that memory has already weathered into dust or sunk beyond recognition, and how much might still be resting quietly beneath our feet, waiting for us to develop the right questions, not just the right tools. When we talk about a first civilization that might have left Earth, we're already reaching back into such remote time that it feels more like geology than storytelling. We're dealing with spans of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years, where our knowledge is mostly inference and possibility. Vast stretches of darkness punctuated by flashes. A new kind of tool. A sudden change in art. A leap in cognition that seems to arrive almost fully formed. The usual explanation leans on gradual evolution punctuated by luck-slow change, broken by occasional strokes of brilliance. But what if it wasn't just luck? What if those sudden leaps were the resurfacing of old knowledge bubbling up like fragments of a dream humanity keeps trying to remember? If a civilization once arose and then departed, their absence would carve a kind of hollow space in the story of Earth. The things we stumble across now, odd alloys, layers of rock that look suspiciously heat-altered, legends about teachers from the sky might all be symptoms of that hollow, slowly refilling itself as the planet resets. Even myths of global floods, fire from above, or sudden darkness might be warped reflections of real catastrophes, possibly even events tied to their leaving. When something unimaginably large happens in prehistory, too vast for accurate memory, too powerful to vanish at once, it condenses into myth. Over thousands of generations, that myth hardens into the closest thing we have to a record. In ancient Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written stories tell of beings descending from the heavens to teach humans farming, building, writing. In Mesoamerica, gods of light and wisdom arrive from across the sea, bearing order and knowledge. In indigenous traditions across Africa and Australia, there are tales of sky ancestors and beings who moved between worlds. Even in Norse stories, the gods are said to have come from elsewhere, to have lived among humans for a time, and then withdrawn, promising to return when the world is ready. The names shift, the landscapes change, but the structure strangely does not. Visitors come from the sky, share something, then go. It could be coincidence. It could simply be the way human imagination tends to shape the unknown, or it could be the faint, blurred echo of something that truly occurred long ago. If an ancient people chose to leave Earth, what would their absence look like to those who remained behind? To the ones not invited, not able, or simply incapable of following? The people left on the ground might have had no frame of reference for where their companions went. Without shared concepts of space or orbit or other worlds, the departure would look like magic, bodies rising into the sky, light without fire, thunder without storms. How else could they have described it except as ascension, judgment, or divine departure? The stories that survived would be saturated with awe, confusion, grief, the emotional weight of losing an entire way of life without the language to explain what that loss really meant. Over centuries, words would shift, meanings would smear together, and soon, even the basic idea of physically leaving Earth could morph into stories of gods floating upward, promises to return from heaven, warnings about disobedience and punishment. Human memory is fragile. Our written records crumble within a few millennia if left unprotected. Oral histories distort within only a handful of generations. If a vast civilization disappeared 50 or 100,000 years ago, we wouldn't expect any scroll, temple, or inscription to survive for us to decode. During that kind of time, continents move. Sea levels swing up and down by hundreds of feet. Every ancient harbor city would drown. Every monumental mountain carving would be worn away. What would endure the longest wouldn't be buildings or language, but patterns, shared ideas echoing through separated cultures. The sense that we began in the sky, and that the sea keeps secrets at the edges of the world. Sometimes the strongest hints of an old civilization aren't obvious ruins, but contradictions. Rock formations that look subtly engineered. Magnetic anomalies that suggest dense metal bodies buried at improbable depths. Veins of material that seem refined rather than raw, in geological layers far older than any known metallurgy. Most of these cases eventually get routine explanations: unusual geological processes, misread instruments, statistical flukes. But each one still cracks the door open, even if only a little. We're forced briefly to ask, if we did find something that absolutely should not be there, something that proved a high level of technology existed long before our timelines allow, would we even be able to see it as such? Our entire scientific worldview is built on an assumption so deep we rarely notice it, that we are the first. That culture began once, in a fairly recent past. That progress climbs in a mostly straight line from stone tools to smartphones. Anything that challenges that story has to push not just against data, but against our sense of identity. And yet, nature doesn't move in straight, one-way paths. It loops. Forests burn and grow again. Rivers change course, and then slowly carve a new one. Species die off, and millions of years later, something eerily similar appears. Why should intelligence be any different? If evolution produced thinking beings once, it can produce them again. If consciousness emerges naturally from complexity and time, it may have surfaced multiple times on the same world. In that light, there's a quiet irony in the way we sweep the skies for intelligent life. We're desperate to know if someone else is out there, while the clearest signs of intelligence might be buried right here, in our own crust, in eras so distant we barely have names for them. The fossil record shows long, flat stretches of relative calm punctuated by sudden transformations. The Cambrian explosion, mass extinctions, abrupt bursts where forms of life appear or vanish almost overnight in geological terms. What if intelligence itself follows a similar rhythm? A wave that rises, shines fiercely, and then recedes, leaving the planet to recover before another wave forms. We might be one such wave. We might not be aware of the tide that brought us to this shore. Deep time makes even large spans feel small. 1,000 years weighs heavily on us, but to the Earth it's barely a heartbeat. 100,000 years is enough to grind mountains down. Imagine a civilization that lasted only 10,000 years, plenty long enough to explore its solar system, to send probes to the outer planets, to build habitats on moons. Then imagine that society ending 1 million years ago. In that million-year gap, everything they left on the surface could be erased. Their cities decomposed and compressed into sedimentary strata. Their satellites deorbited, crashed, or decayed. Orbital paths altered by gravitational nudges. To us, their once bright age would appear as silence. Maybe the only surviving trace would be something intangible, carried forward in us, a blend of curiosity, a hunger for horizons, a reverence for the skies that feels older than our written memory. Traits passed down not as stories, but as tendencies, like a recurring dream that runs along the entire species line. If such a civilization existed, they might have left because they recognized a pattern. The geological record is full of apocalypse-scale events, supervolcano eruptions, massive impacts, sudden climate convulsions. Maybe they lived through one too many. Maybe they realized that no matter how advanced you become, staying anchored to a single world is a long-term gamble. Or maybe the Earth didn't push them away at all. Maybe the universe simply pulled harder. The same way a fledgling eventually leaves its nest, not out of resentment, but out of inevitability. Their decision to depart might have been less of a frantic escape and more of a calm step forward, a planetary coming of age. And yet, even if they thrived elsewhere, echoes have a way of looping back. The stories they left behind could trickle down through the ages, shaping the minds of those who came after. Without knowing why, later humans might grow obsessed with the same directions, the same technologies, the same dreams. We might fixate on rockets and stations and interplanetary travel not only because we can, but because something deep within us remembers that this is what we're supposed to do. The stars might feel familiar because in some remote sense, they once were. In nearly every ancient culture, there are references to a prior era when humanity was somehow closer to the heavens, a time of luminous knowledge, harmony, or effortless understanding. Those eras almost always end with a fall, a flood, a fire, a sundering, or a departure. The golden age collapses, and humanity starts over again, stumbling in the dark. What if those myths aren't describing moral decline so much as the last contact between those who departed and those who stayed? A brief overlap, where two phases of humanity, one leaving, one remaining, coexisted before the world shifted and memory reset. We can't prove it. Maybe we never will. But the idea has a peculiar emotional logic. Civilizations seem to hit a crossroads sooner or later, a choice between stagnation and transformation. We're flirting with that edge ourselves right now, trying to decide whether we will remain bound to one vulnerable planet or extend ourselves into the larger environment of space. If every intelligent species eventually finds its way to that threshold, some will decide to climb past it. They'll step off their world and into the unknown. If that's true, then the cosmos might be dotted with abandoned birthplaces. Worlds like Earth that once hosted spacefaring cultures who chose, finally, to move on. Our planet could have been one of those long ago. We might be walking atop the same ground an earlier humanity once left behind, tracing their forgotten trail as we rebuild their tools, relearn their physics, and resurrect their ancient longing for elsewhere. We tend to view ourselves as the first flame of intelligence on this world. But maybe we're the rekindling of embers, the returning wave in a tide that has risen and fallen many times before. That doesn't have to be a sad thought. In a way, it's reassuring. It suggests that life, awareness, curiosity, these things don't vanish easily. They cycle. They reemerge. They find new shapes and new voices. The first civilization might be gone, but some essence of them could run through us, nudging our hands as we align telescopes, scribble equations, or watch the Milky Way and feel that sharp, unnameable ache. Maybe, somewhere out there, those who left still notice us. Maybe they track our radio hiss and launch signatures with the same gentle interest we show baby sea turtles scrambling toward the ocean. They might see our first rockets and early probes visiting places they once called home and think, they're getting there. Perhaps they're in no rush. They may be waiting until we're steady enough, wise enough, humble enough to stand alongside them, not as children, but as equals. When that day comes, it won't feel like meeting aliens. It'll feel like a reunion, like recognizing a family resemblance that was always there. For now, all we truly possess are echoes, faint rhythms in legend and religion, subtle urges in our psychology, that constant tug of the stars. Those echoes may be all that remains of a civilization that left long ago. Or they might simply be what happens when human imagination tries to touch something bigger than itself. Either way, the result is the same: a quiet, persistent yearning, a curiosity that refuses to die down. So we keep excavating, keep scanning, keep inventing stories. And somewhere between measured data and ancient tales, between fossils and fables, the past hums softly, reminding us that nothing ever really vanishes. It only changes shape, waiting patiently to be recognized by whoever is willing to listen. And as we sink a little deeper into that thought, it becomes natural to ask, if myths are memory, can memory become evidence? Can these old stories correspond to something we might actually find in the earth, in the sky, in the geological scars of our world? Because if there truly was a first civilization that left, they might have done more than just pass on stories. They might have written their presence very faintly into the planet itself, into the patterns of life, into the background of our reality, patiently awaiting the moment when we'd look closely enough to see them. Every culture on Earth tells stories about the sky, about beings who dwelt among the stars, descended from them, or briefly visited this world to test, guide, or teach human beings. Some called them gods. Others knew them as ancestors, wanderers, or messengers. The titles shifted, but the patterns stayed nearly the same. These stories were never casual. They were told carefully, repeated across countless lifetimes until they stopped being merely tales and became something else. Memory wearing the costume of myth. It's simple to dismiss myth as pure invention, as our earliest attempt to plug silence with meaning. But when you look closely, myths behave more like fossils. They hold onto shape after the original substance has long since vanished. They preserve outlines and patterns that hint at something solid that once existed. Myths might not reveal exactly what happened, but they can point to the fact that something did happen, something too immense, too strange, or too subtle to be captured in plain description. So it became story instead, softened, symbolized, reshaped, so it could survive the passage of time. If a first civilization truly left Earth, their departure would not have passed unnoticed by those left behind. Any witness, whether an early human without writing, or another hominin species still living in small communities, would have struggled to make sense of it. Imagine trying to describe what you see. Brilliant lights rising without fire, thunder with no storm, shapes parting the sky and not returning. You wouldn't speak of propulsion systems or orbital mechanics. You would use the only language available: gods lifting into heaven, stars opening, chariots of fire, or great birds of light carrying people away. Myth would be their physics. Story would be their science. Across continents, cultures that never met still produce tales that echo each other. People separated by oceans and millennia still speak of great floods, sky beings, bringers of knowledge from above, and promises that one day, those beings will come again. In ancient Mesopotamia, there are the Anunnaki divine figures arriving from the heavens to shape human destiny and teach essential arts. Among the Dogon of Mali, we find the Nomo, amphibious entities from the Sirius system, descending to restore order and impart wisdom. In ancient Mesoamerica, shining deities arrive across the water, bearers of calendars and agricultural secrets. In Australia, Aboriginal traditions speak of sky spirits, the Wandjina, painted with radiant heads and featureless faces. Across the Pacific, Island cultures remember ancestors who came from the stars in canoes, promising to return. We can interpret all of this as metaphor, and in many ways, it is. But when metaphors recur across widely separated societies, they begin to look less like random invention and more like translation. Many different languages, perhaps describing the same kind of event. Maybe they were all interpreting variations of a single underlying reality, a moment when those who left Earth made themselves visible again, or when remnants of that first civilization reappeared briefly among those who had stayed. If something like that truly happened, its impact would be indelible. It would stamp itself into the human imagination so deeply that even as names and details were lost, the core images, the descent, the teaching, the departure, the promise would continue, woven into the myths of every region. Global flood stories are another repeating shape. Nearly every ancestral tradition includes some version of a great deluge that wipes away an age, sparing only a few who rebuild afterward. The Sumerian flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah's Ark in the Hebrew narrative, Manu in Hindu tradition, Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek myth, the Aztec accounts of multiple suns and successive destructions by water. Different names, same architecture, a world-resetting flood, a handful of survivors, a new beginning. Maybe there really was a catastrophic flood, or even many, triggered by rapid glacial melt, a sudden sea level jump, or an impact event. Or perhaps the flood was a stand-in for some other kind of global disruption, a metaphor for a planetary reset. If the first civilization manipulated energy on a grand scale, tapped into Earth's magnetic field, altered atmospheric chemistry, extracted enormous amounts of power from the crust, then the side effects might look like judgment from the sky to people who came much later. Climate whiplash, violent storms, ocean surges, strange lights. A technologically driven upheaval remembered dimly as divine punishment for sins barely understood. One more pattern recurs again and again. The fall. An age in which humans and gods, or mortals and sky beings, are close, followed by a rift, a loss of knowledge, a banishment, a closed gate. Prometheus, stealing fire for humanity, and being punished. The story of Eden, where humans are expelled and denied access to a higher state of knowing. Sumerian tales of conflicts between divine figures and humans, followed by separation. Seen through one lens, these are moral parables. Seen through another, they might be distorted memories of a time when certain humans still knew how to cross between Earth and sky, between planet and orbit. And then, for whatever reason, that knowledge vanished. The boundary between ground and sky hardened again. The ones who still held the key left. The ones who remained turned that loss into sacred story. Even details within myths may carry more information than we're used to granting them. The Maya tracked the solar year with astonishing precision. Ancient Egyptians aligned the Great Pyramid with an accuracy that would challenge even modern tools, tying structural lines to cardinal directions and specific stars. Builders of places like Stonehenge or Nabta Playa created complex alignments with solstices and lunar cycles, encoding astronomical relationships into stone. Some Paleolithic cave art appears to mirror constellations, suggesting that sky mapping is far older than we once assumed. How did relatively early cultures, supposedly just emerging from hunter-gatherer life, pull off such careful tracking of celestial motion? It's possible they simply watched long enough. Human observation can be powerful. But it's also possible they inherited not star charts themselves, but storylines that carried the data indirectly. In many oral traditions, myths double as storage devices. Directions for planting, navigation routes, seasonal patterns, even survival strategies get wrapped in stories, songs, and rituals so they can be remembered without writing. Polynesian navigators crossed vast stretches of ocean by memorizing chants about the positions of stars, the feel of swells, the flights of birds. Aboriginal Dreamtime narratives encode exact movements of constellations and seasonal markers in tales of ancestors and spirits. If knowledge from a prior civilization trickled down before they left, Or as they left, this is how it could endure, as narrative frameworks storing practical truths beneath layers of metaphor. Science disguised as saga. A truly old civilization might have realized something we're only beginning to grasp. That physical objects don't last, but stories do. Text erodes, metal rusts, data formats die. But a story, embedded in a culture's rituals and identity, can span unimaginable stretches of time. It mutates, but it survives. Myths don't preserve the literal world, they preserve the feeling of it, the emotional contour of events too big for language. They keep alive the knowledge that something happened here, even when the details have faded beyond recall. The obvious question is, how much can survive that way? 10,000 years is enough to warp any oral tale beyond recognition. 50,000 years, and almost everything but the core mood and a few resilient images will be gone. Yet some essence can still hang on. That might explain why nearly every culture connects the sky with origins, and why death is so often rendered as an ascent, a rising, a return to the heavens. Why enlightenment is depicted as rising above, and why we still instinctively look upward for meaning. Somewhere deep inside, we seem to hold a shared sense that our story and the stars are linked, not just symbolically, but intimately. Not that we were born from them in a purely physical sense, but that some essential part of our identity is tied to that upward direction. If the first civilization foresaw how flimsy material markers are in the face of deep time, they might have concluded that their legacy couldn't be carved in stone or etched in metal. They might have decided the only medium capable of surviving was mind itself. So they seeded their memory in us, not in our genes as explicit sentences, but in our psyche as dispositions, in our love of pattern, in our compulsion to tell tales of sky beings, hidden worlds, and return. They might have gathered their children and told them where they were going, knowing that their children would retell those stories, and so on across unthinkable stretches of time, until the details blurred into religion and then into bedtime stories. But embedded within would remain one steady message. You came from the stars. You will go back to the stars. Even our modern myths, science fiction sagas of starships, interstellar empires, ancient off-world architects might be more than novelty. They could be imagination trying to reconstruct what memory can't quite recall. We picture ring-shaped stations, jump gates, warp drives, archives on distant moons. Perhaps not because we've never seen such things, but because some dim ancestral echo of them lingers, and our creative minds keep circling back. When we invent galactic civilizations and elaborate interplanetary histories, we might be sketching not just potential futures, but distorted recollections of long-erased realities. In that sense, myth isn't the opposite of science. It's an older branch on the same tree. Before we had measures, we had metaphors. Before we charted orbits, we told stories about skywalkers and world bridges. Imagination was the first laboratory, the first telescope, the first archive. Through it, ideas traveled across dark ages that would have destroyed any library. The deeper implication is that myth may contain the first rough record of humanity, encountering something beyond itself, whether that beyond was an earlier human civilization, its departing survivors, or something stranger. If we listen carefully, certain myths start to sound like timelines. The arrival of radiant ones, the teaching of arts and sciences, the schism between heaven and earth, the promise of return at the end of a cycle. Taken together, they sound almost procedural, like steps in a repeating pattern. A civilization ascends, leaves emissaries, withdraws, and someday reappears when its home has birthed minds ready to understand. We might even be living in that return phase without recognizing it. The sense so many people feel when gazing at the night sky, that mix of awe, melancholy, and uncanny familiarity, might be more than poetry. It might be a low-level memory shared across the species. A feeling that we are not simply looking outward, but back towards something we've known before. Some researchers already approach myth less as fantasy and more as data. They comb through stories from distant cultures, looking for recurring shapes that hint at real ancient events. Comets, volcanoes, sea level shifts, even encounters with unusual visitors. Flood narratives line up startlingly well in details. Accounts of luminous teachers appear on every continent. Descriptions of the bright ones, the shining people, the radiant visitors recur again and again. It's possible that myth encodes events so early they predate all writing by tens of thousands of years, handed down through generations upon generations, each one adjusting the surface while the core image remains. If we treated these tales as anthropological artifacts rather than superstition, if we read them as what happens when early cultures struggle to describe literal events using limited language, we might discover what amounts to the first human record of contact with something more advanced, even if that something was just another branch of ourselves. Still, even without definitive proof, the sheer persistence of these stories is meaningful. They hold emotional truth, even when all literal detail is lost. They remind us that humans have always sensed connection to a reality beyond the visible. That connection might be internal, cosmic, spiritual, or all three. But it feels older than any particular culture or religion. If a civilization truly left this planet long ago, our restlessness, our ache for the stars, might be the riverbed their departure carved in our collective psyche. Even dry, the channel remains, guiding the flow of our dreams. So when we listen to legends of gods and sky roads, of floods and radiant visitors, we can choose to hear them differently. Not as primitive guesses, but as messages from an older version of ourselves. A memory stretched across ages, hoping someday to be recognized. Somewhere within those myths, beneath symbols of serpents, wheels of fire, stairways to heaven might lie the very first human attempt to record the moment when a civilization outgrew its cradle and left this world behind. And as we keep looking for physical traces, perhaps we should remember that the most durable artifact we have might not be stone or metal, but story itself, carried in song, in ritual, in whispered tales by the fire, endlessly retold, quietly reminding us we come from the stars, and that one day we will go back. If myth is memory, then the next step is to ask how memory might map onto matter. Where could we look for the faintest physical signatures that line up with what our oldest stories have been hinting at all along? Because if the first civilization really existed, their departure may have left marks, not just in our imagination, but in the deep fabric of earth and sky subtle, but still there for those patient enough to seek them. If a civilization truly chose to leave Earth, one of the strangest questions isn't how they managed to travel the stars, but how they erased themselves so completely. No obvious residue in the soil, no tool we can date with certainty to their time, no unmistakable artifact, only scattered anomalies and silence. For a species advanced enough to cross interstellar distances, that kind of vanishing would almost have to be intentional. And if it was intentional, it was also methodical. They would have understood exactly how to slip out of the geological and archaeological records so thoroughly that, from our perspective, it would appear as if they'd never been here at all. When we picture ancient cultures, we imagine temples crumbling under vines, toppled columns, worn pathways, fragments of fired clay. But those relics exist because of the technologies those cultures used. Heavy stone, durable ceramics, tools built to last, simply because the materials they worked with were slow to decay. Our own technology is far more fragile. Metals corrode, plastics fracture, break down, or become microscopic grains. Magnetic storage wipes, paper burns. If humanity vanished tomorrow and 10,000 years passed, what would remain? A few stone structures, some stubborn pyramids, scattered chunks of concrete, traces of weird chemistry in certain soils. Given a few million years, even those would be erased. Our cities would dissolve into dust and sediment. Our tallest towers would become minor blips in geological layers. From orbit, Earth would look fresh, renewed, as though we had never existed at all. Earth's skin constantly rewrites itself. Tectonic plates move, pushing up mountains and dragging floors of oceans down into the mantle. Volcanoes flood landscapes with new rock. Rivers erode and rearrange everything in their path. If an advanced civilization thrived even a few 100,000 years before us, most of its structures, especially those on the surface, would be pulverized or subducted by now. Past a certain timescale, the only real survivors of a high-tech age would be chemical. Odd isotopic distributions, unusual residues in old sediments, strange metals fused into rock evidence less of buildings than of industry. Scientists sometimes talk about an Anthropocene signal, the distinct chemical footprint our modern civilization is leaving in the planet's strata. Plastic embedded in sediments, elevated levels of heavy metals, traces of nitrogen and carbon from fertilizers and burning, radionuclides from nuclear activity. Those markers will persist long after our architecture is gone, faint flags in rock that say, something was here, and it was busy. If there was a civilization before us, we might expect a similar signal buried deeper down. Some researchers have actually looked for such signs. They've noted weird spikes in carbon levels, unexplained magnetic shifts, deposits of metals that appear too refined for natural processes, layers of rock that look partially melted across wide regions. None of these clues is definitive. Each has plausible natural explanations. Volcanic events, asteroid strikes, odd mineralization processes. But the possibility remains that we might stand atop the geological shadow of an earlier technological epoch without recognizing it. Time alone could have erased most material traces, but disappearance might also have involved choice. If the first civilization matured far beyond our current stage, they might have grown to value leaving their home world clean. Perhaps they knew that true advancement meant parting without scars. They could have designed their technology to be reversible materials that disassembled themselves into ordinary elements when no longer needed, machines that biodegraded or sublimated, buildings that fell back into soil and air, data encoded in non-lasting mediums that dissolved into background noise once their job was done. Their presence on Earth could have been nearly zero waste, their exit almost surgical. Meanwhile, nature would have been their quiet collaborator. Earth's magnetic field flips polarity at irregular intervals. Each reversal scrambles some forms of magnetic storage and can cloak or alter signals in the crust. Cosmic rays constantly batter the atmosphere and surface, breaking molecular bonds and corrupting delicate structures. Over millions of years, even deeply buried things can be scrambled, compressed, heated beyond recognition. The ocean floors tell a strange version of Earth's memory. They hold sediments and chemical traces from ages past, yet they're also among the youngest surfaces on the planet. The oldest seafloor is under 200 million years old. Everything older has been dragged downward and recycled. If an advanced culture favored the coasts, as our own does its ancient ports and shoreline cities would now be deep underwater or swallowed at subduction zones, ground into magma and remade. This is the unsettling core of what some scientists call the Silurian hypothesis, a serious thought experiment proposed by Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt. They asked, if an industrial civilization rose on Earth millions of years before humans, would we be able to detect it now? Their tentative conclusion, maybe, but probably not clearly. Even a globally spread, technologically adept civilization would become almost invisible with enough time. What would remain would be subtle anomalies in the rock record that could easily be mistaken for natural variation. In other words, the absence of clear evidence is not particularly surprising. Our inability to find them doesn't automatically mean they were never there. It may simply mean we're asking the planet for certainties it can't give. The forces that nurture life also act as masters of erasure. Ice smooths, fire transforms, water hides and rearranges, wind wears down and carries away. The same processes that allow ecosystems to refresh themselves also compost their own history. For a species that decided to leave and not look back, this would be ideal. All they had to do was step away. The planet would quietly handle the rest. Their departure might not have been a single grand moment, but a long, slow migration. A few stations off-world at first, then more, farther away. Each generation moving a little deeper into space, taking knowledge with them. The ones who remained would be left with partial blueprints, half-remembered procedures, and stories. Imagine the last few centuries of such a civilization on Earth. The ones leaving are mostly gone. Those who stay behind know only that the age is ending. They have fragments, broken machines, the lore of how things might work, but not enough to rebuild the whole. They might revert to simpler tools by necessity. Yet the memory of what once existed would linger for a while. Stories of the people who flew, of towers that touched the sky, of lights that burned with no fuel. Eventually, even those stories would blur. The last individuals who truly knew why or how the departure took place would die. In time, they'd be remembered as unusually wise or powerful figures, then as demigods, then as legends, finally, as distant myths with no traceable origin. From a purely scientific angle, vanishing without a trace doesn't require magic. It can be accomplished by a combination of time, design, and fragility. One intriguing possibility is that the first civilization may have transitioned away from physical infrastructure altogether. If they found ways to embed consciousness into machines, fields, or other substrates, they might have gradually outgrown the need for heavy, durable hardware. Their buildings could have become temporary configurations of energy. Their cities, reprogrammable arrangements of matter. If their last stage on Earth consisted of minimal physical footprint and maximal informational density, then once their power networks were shut down or repurposed, almost nothing material would remain. Imagine a civilization whose libraries lived in quantum states fleeting, dynamic, impossibly fragile to later observers. A single planetary catastrophe, or a deliberate system-wide shutdown, could wipe out the entire structure in an instant. They may also have learned to extract energy in ways that left almost no scars, harnessing geothermal flows gently, tapping magnetic induction from the planet's field, using sunlight with near total efficiency. Their industry could have been effectively invisible to archaeologists because it didn't require vast mines, smelters, or fossil fuels. It would leave far fewer mineral and chemical anomalies than ours. At the far edge of speculation lies another path. Transcendence, not as mystical metaphor, but as a technological transition to states of matter and energy we barely understand. They could have discovered how to inhabit the deeper fabric of reality, manipulating space-time, shifting into quantum patterns, existing as coherent structures in what we currently call vacuum. In that case, leaving Earth might not have meant flying away at all. It might have meant moving sideways into an invisible layer of the same space. Quantum physics already tells us that what looks empty is thick with activity fields vibrating, particles popping in and out of existence, probabilities rippling. A civilization thousands or millions of years ahead of us might operate in that domain as easily as we move through air and water. Their disappearance from our level of reality would be like water evaporating. The liquid surface would look empty, but the molecules would still be present, simply in another form. The more we learn about the universe, the more plausible these kinds of transitions become. Reality doesn't appear to be a single flat stage, but a layered structure. A sufficiently advanced intelligence might simply choose to relocate deeper into that structure. Yet even the most grounded, non-mystical version of disappearance underscores the same truth. Vanishing is easy. It's staying visible that's hard. Our universe is full of things that used to shine and no longer do. Stars go out, galaxies drift apart, species end, whole ecosystems rise, flourish, and vanish. The cosmic background is mostly quiet. Against that backdrop, the survival of any trace at all is the real anomaly. If a civilization learned to accept impermanence instead of fighting it, to align its fate with the universe's eventual cooling and spreading, And then its final act might have been not a desperate clinging to form, but a graceful surrender, pulling up its roots, dissolving its artifacts, and becoming something more subtle. Influence rather than architecture, pattern rather than monument. We catch glimmers of this logic in our own philosophies and sciences. Buddhism speaks of impermanence and non-attachment, of release coming from letting go. Physics tells us energy and matter cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Ecology shows us how decay feeds new life and how every ending seeds a beginning. Everywhere we look, disappearance is less an absolute stop than a phase change. The first civilization may have simply taken this principle seriously. Rather than insisting on relics, they might have allowed themselves to become part of the underlying currents that shape reality. If so, perhaps we're not supposed to find giant machines or indestructible towers. Maybe what they left behind is subtler, recurring tendencies in how life organizes itself, in how intelligence behaves, in how worlds move toward complexity, and then toward the stars. Those are the real ancestral bones embedded not in rock, but in the way the universe leans toward awareness, the drive to explore, the impulse to build ever more precise instruments, the desire to know where we come from and where we're going. These might be their inheritance working through us, the echo of their choices guiding our own. In that light, their disappearance isn't loss, it's bequest. They didn't vanish into nothing. They sank into the soil of existence and became nourishment for whatever came next. We are perhaps one of the flowers that grew from that buried root. And if that's true, our own eventual departure from Earth, if it happens, won't be an isolated act either. It will be part of the same long story. One civilization after another, learning to appear and disappear, to take only what they need, and to leave a world ready for whoever stirs next. Which raises another question. If their traces aren't meant to be found in towering ruins, where should we look instead? If the real clues were woven into the planet itself, into the geometry of ecosystems, the chemistry of rocks, the strange capacities of DNA, what would those clues look like? Maybe the next step is to turn our attention inward and downward, to examine the Earth, not just as a stage on which civilization appears, but as an active participant that carries memory in ways we're only starting to suspect. Imagine Earth in a much earlier era, not the version we usually picture with mammoths and stone-tipped spears, but a far older world, still recovering from its last great convulsion. The outlines of the continents weren't what we know now. The air was denser, the climate stranger. The stars formed familiar constellations, but their positions were just slightly off. In that ancient landscape, if a civilization had already arisen, if the first minds capable of leaving their cradle were living and building, then Earth itself would have been both their parent and their launchpad. If they truly prepared to leave, their departure wouldn't have been a single decision or one dramatic day. It would have been the final chapter of a very long exchange with the planet that raised them. We usually imagine leaving a world as an engineering project. Rockets, engines, fuel depots, launch windows. But for a civilization that had grown in step with Earth's own rhythms for tens of thousands of years, departure would have had another dimension: harmony. They would have known that stepping out into the cosmos wasn't just about escaping gravity. It was about ending a relationship properly. They would have understood that taking their first real step into space meant closing a chapter with Earth in a way that preserved its ability to host life again. Leaving, not as looters or runaways, but as mature beings, finishing a cycle. So perhaps their first task wasn't to build ships, but to understand limits, to realize that even a rich world has boundaries, finite metals, finite energy in convenient forms, finite capacity to absorb waste without tipping into chaos. We're only truly beginning to confront that reality now. The first civilization, if it existed, might have gone through a similar crisis: resource strain, climate disruption, mass extinctions triggered by their own actions. But instead of pushing the planet past the breaking point, maybe they learned to adapt. They might have turned from extraction to circulation, drawing power not through burning or ripping things apart, but by tapping deep, renewable flows. They could have mastered geothermal power on a global scale, converting the planet's internal heat into clean energy without scarring the crust. They might have harnessed subtle resonances in Earth's magnetic field. They likely use sunlight far more efficiently than we do, capturing and storing it in ways that left almost no trace. If they learned to balance themselves with their environment, then leaving Earth wouldn't have been an escape from ruin. It would have been the next logical step once home and inhabitant had reached equilibrium. A transformation, not a retreat. That raises another question. What does a civilization have to become before it's truly ready to leave its world? In our time, we're only beginning to behave like a single species. Borders, conflicts, and rivalries still dominate us. Yet the infrastructure of global thinking is already visible. The internet, worldwide science, shared satellites, international responses to planetary threats. A civilization prepared to depart would likely have traveled far beyond us in that direction. It would have had to unify at least in purpose, if not in every belief. To leave, they first needed to learn to cooperate. Fragmented tribes don't build starships. Before any of their vessels left orbit, they would have spent ages looking inward and outward at the same time. They would have mapped every nuance of their planet. Air currents, ocean cycles, tectonic motions, magnetic lines. They would have tracked the orbits of moons and the movements of planets with mathematical care. They would have studied the sun in all its moods, learning how its rhythms influenced their weather, their biology, their entire world. In time, their understanding of physics and biology might have fused into something far more integrated than our divided sciences. To them, engineering, ecology, and cosmology wouldn't be separate fields, but facets of one larger discipline. How to resonate with the universe rather than fight it. If they knew how to live that way, it would show in what they built. Some of the oldest structures on Earth already hint at a forgotten obsession with alignment. Stone circles, pyramids, mounds, and pillars, carefully tuned to solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, and specific stars. We often label them as temples or ritual centers, because that's the closest category we have. But what if some of these alignments are faint aftershocks of older knowledge, handed down from a time when such structures weren't symbolic at all, but functional instruments? Maybe they were once part of a global observing network, tools for tracking orbital mechanics and celestial paths, stepping stones toward leaving the planet behind. To us, they look like shrines. To their builders, they might have been part of a navigational system calibrated not just for seasons but for launch windows. Before a species can leave a world responsibly, it likely must learn to protect it. Not because it intends to return, but because it realizes its home is part of a living network, larger than itself. The first civilization might have created buffer systems to keep Earth thriving after they were gone. Genetically robust ecosystems, diversified species with overlapping niches, self-correcting cycles in oceans and forests. In that sense, what we now consider the natural balance of Earth might be partly organic, partly engineered. Not artificial in a crude mechanical way, but subtly guided. A planetary garden intentionally set up to endure centuries and millennia of change. If that idea seems too large, consider where we are headed. We already talk about terraforming Mars, introducing microbes, altering its atmosphere, eventually crafting biospheres from scratch. We develop sealed habitats, self-sustaining ecological loops, seeds, and gene banks meant to outlive any one generation. In a primitive way, we're practicing what they may have mastered, becoming designers of entire environments. So if the first civilization saw departure on the horizon, they may have spent a very long time tutoring Earth, helping its systems settle into self-sustaining balance. What we call Gaia, the hypothesis that Earth acts like a single living organism, might reflect not only natural feedback loops, but the long-term outcome of intentional tuning. They may have been gardeners who stepped away only after they were sure the garden could sustain itself. Then there is the question of continuity. How do you make sure some seed of your knowledge persists, especially when you know buildings and books will vanish? One answer is biology. DNA is a remarkably durable information storage system. Once written into the living code of a species, a trait can persist for immense spans of time. What if they found ways to encode aspects of their legacy into life itself, not as detailed messages but as capacities and drives? A predisposition for language, a tendency toward abstraction and symbol, a powerful instinct for cooperation and for curiosity, the nagging need to ask, why, even when there is no immediate survival benefit. Those very traits we consider uniquely human might be part of their gift. They may not have carved their history on stone tablets. They may have written it into us as potential. We're just now learning how to store digital data in DNA strands, how to alter genomes intentionally, how to preserve information across generations in living tissue. If we, at this early stage, can imagine doing that, then it isn't unreasonable to think that someone older and wiser may have already done it long ago. If so, then our restless imagination, our urge to build and explore, might be their echo not of their specific memories, but of their temperament. The preparation to leave wouldn't have been only technological, it would have been emotional and philosophical as well. At some point, they would have had to face the reality of leaving their birthplace behind, not as a sudden tragedy, but as a deliberate rite of passage. They would have needed rituals, art, and stories to help them process that shift. No longer beings of a single world, but participants in a much larger field. They might have painted their skies, carved their mountains, composed vast sonic works or collective performances to anchor the moment in their shared consciousness, not as a lament, but as a promise. In those fragments of instinct, we feel our fixation with images of Earth from space, our deep emotional reaction to seeing our planet as a small blue sphere in darkness. We may be catching traces of those old feelings. Our modern overview effect, that surge of unity and awe astronauts describe, could be a new expression of something the first civilization experienced when they watched Earth recede below their own vessels. If they left, they needed vehicles. But vehicle might mean something very different from our chemical rockets and metal shells. Advanced travel could rely on completely different principles, tapping into gravitational gradients, surfing electromagnetic fields, folding space-time, or riding along natural cosmic currents. They might have built habitats that were less like ships and more like ecosystems in motion, enclosed biospheres traveling with them, complete with forests, oceans in miniature, and carefully balanced food webs. Not cold machines, but traveling worlds, or seeds of worlds. Time would not have been their enemy, but their raw material. If they could slow their own biology, or upload themselves into more durable substrates, they could afford journeys that took millennia. For them, far would be measured less in miles, and more in cycles of sleep and awakening. They may not even have organized their journey around destinations the way we imagine. They might have treated space as a continuous environment, a web of opportunities rather than a series of isolated points. Instead of setting out to conquer this or that star system, they could have drifted slowly, seeding life here and there, interacting gently with emerging biospheres, and moving on. In that sense, they would have been both travelers and gardeners on a cosmic scale, planting, observing, and trusting time to do what it always does: transform. If Earth was once part of their great preparation, the signs might look less like artifacts and more like harmony. A planet tuned to maintain life over improbable durations. A dominant species imbued with an inner compass pointing upward. A biosphere that, once awakened, quickly grows new minds capable of asking the same old questions. From that vantage, the fact that we are now on the brink of becoming spacefaring doesn't look like a random accident. It looks like a pattern completing itself. A long, slow arc returning to its natural course. The Earth we know, with its self-regulating cycles and deep resilience, could be the legacy of those who once chose to leave, and chose to do so gently. Our sudden burst of technological progress over the last few centuries, our accelerating obsession with space and extraterrestrial life, our reawakening interest in ancient myths that tie us to the stars, all of that might be less of a new era and more of a reactivation, a memory coming back online. Earth, through us, might be finishing something it began a very long time ago. There's a strange beauty in that possibility. It means that everything we're doing, launching telescopes, sending small machines to other planets, searching for biosignatures and technosignatures, is part of an ancient rhythm. We're not inventing the urge to explore. We're inheriting it. If that's the case, then Earth is not just a rock we happen to stand on. It's a teacher, and we are its latest students. It has already coached one civilization through the process of rising, leaving, and letting go. Now, through subtle pressures and opportunities, it's guiding us through the same curriculum. Every storm, every climate shift, every resource limit, every burst of technological insight could be part of that lesson. How to grow up as a planetary species without destroying the classroom. When you look up and feel that quiet, electric anticipation, that sense that something is waiting out there, that we are on the threshold of something vast, that feeling might not be a fantasy at all. It might be the old signal of readiness stirring again. A message humming beneath consciousness, shared between the planet and the beings who walk on it. We've done this before. We can do it again. If the first civilization truly prepared Earth for departure once, they probably left more than stories and instincts. They may have scattered hints, physical, chemical, orbital, across the solar system and beyond. Clues that only a species strong and curious enough to approach the same threshold would ever be able to find. Because being ready to leave isn't only about having somewhere to go. It's also about leaving something meaningful behind. And somewhere, hidden in mountains, oceans, or the dust of neighboring worlds, their final preparations might still be waiting to be noticed. Somewhere out in the wide, dim spaces of our solar system, we're already brushing against the ruins of deep time, though we rarely call them that. Every probe, every rover, every orbital survey is a kind of archaeologist sweeping away layers of dust and distance, looking for something ancient that might explain how we came to be. The twist is that we might be searching for our own forgotten footsteps. If a first civilization truly left Earth, their traces may not lie under our forests and cities, but scattered in the sky on nearby worlds, in the asteroid belt, on distant icy moons. And the people now searching for such clues might not even realize that what they're looking for is a previous chapter of the same story we're living. On Earth, archaeology is a science of layers. Time is measured in strata, each band of soil or sediment a page in a patient book. Translate that same mindset into the cosmos, and the layers become far more immense. The tools change from trowels and brushes to cameras, spectrometers, and radio telescopes. Yet the goal is strangely similar: to find traces of intelligence in the arrangement of matter, in the patterns left on landscapes, in anomalies that don't fit simple natural causes. Space archaeology. A field still young is beginning to look past Earth's atmosphere not just for resources but for relics. Not only alien ones but potentially our own, from a phase of humanity long erased from memory. The most logical places to search first are the quiet ones. Worlds with little or no atmosphere, where nothing much erodes or corrodes. They are the solar system's silent witnesses. Our moon is a prime example. Its surface is like an unedited record. Every impact, every footprint, every piece of debris remains unless something strikes it directly. There's no wind, no rain, no running water to wash things away. The landing sites from our own Apollo missions will likely outlast any building on Earth by thousands, maybe millions, of years. So if a civilization older than ours ever visited the moon, if they built a base, a monument, or even a storage vault, some trace of it could still be there. It might be buried beneath several feet of regolith, pitted by micrometeorites and camouflaged by dust, but not obliterated. Modern observations have already picked up oddities on the lunar surface. Strange geometric shadow patterns, unusually symmetrical mounds, peculiar subsurface cavities. Most can be explained by ordinary geology, low-resolution imaging artifacts, or tricks of lighting and perspective. Still, the possibility lingers that something non-natural could be sitting there, waiting for a closer look. Because unlike on Earth, the Moon does not forget easily. Mars is another possible archive. Once a world with rivers, lakes, perhaps even shallow seas and a thicker atmosphere, it is now dry and air-thin but remarkably stable. The rovers crawling over its sands today are like slow-motion field workers, reading exposed sedimentary layers that have been undisturbed for ages. Now and then, an image from Mars stirs debate rocks that look carved, ridges that seem too regular, curious mineral patterns that raise eyebrows. Most of these mysteries evaporate under careful scrutiny. Yet the mere fact that we keep seeing things that remind us of structure hints at how ready we are to project our own past outward. If the first civilization ever used Mars as a staging ground, a refuge, or an experiment in terraforming, the evidence might be subtle. Unnatural isotopic ratios, strangely pure metals, symmetrical underground cavities, or relics disguised as random boulders. Then there is the asteroid belt, that scattered ring of broken rock and metal between Mars and Jupiter. Some astronomers have wondered if it might be the remains of a shattered planet. Whether or not that's true, it's a region overflowing with potential resources. Its metallic asteroids are rich in nickel, iron, and other elements that would be irresistible to a spacefaring culture. To us, these objects look like debris. To a civilization intent on building habitats and starships, they would look like raw material. It's not unimaginable that the belt was, at some point, heavily mined. The signatures of such activity might still exist. Unusually shaped asteroids, hollowed-out bodies with internal cavities, clusters of objects in unnatural orbits. With time, any structures built into those rocks might break down, collapse, or become filled with rubble. From the outside, they would now appear like ordinary asteroids. Only careful mapping of mass, density, and interior structure would reveal that something was once carved within. Farther out lie the outer giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and their moons. Some of these moons are especially intriguing. Europa likely hides a global ocean beneath its ice. Titan has a thick atmosphere and liquid methane rivers. Enceladus spews geysers from a subsurface sea. These worlds are like sealed laboratories, each preserving conditions that haven't changed much in massive spans of time. If the first civilization ventured outward, such moons might have been perfect laboratories or sanctuaries. An ocean world under ice is naturally shielded from radiation and impacts. An atmosphere-rich moon could support exotic ecosystems or engineered bioforms. And because these environments evolve slowly, anything placed there could remain astonishingly well preserved. Beyond even that is the Kuiper Belt home to dwarf planets like Pluto and a host of icy bodies. And still farther, stretching into a vast sphere, the hypothesized Oort cloud, where comets drift in immense distant orbits. These regions change so slowly that a structure or device placed there could, in theory, endure for eons. A civilization interested in long-term observation might have hidden monitors or archives in these outer realms. Small, dark, and cold, they would be nearly invisible against the background of space. We've just begun to send probes to this region. We've barely glanced at most of these objects. The tools of this new kind of archaeology are not shovels, but sensors and math. Spectroscopy lets us read the composition of distant surfaces and atmospheres by how they manipulate light. Radio telescopes let us detect faint emissions, both natural and artificial. High-resolution imaging reveals patterns, straight edges where none should be, repeated spacing that defies random processes, orbital configurations hinting at deliberate arrangement. Astronomers use these same methods to search for alien civilizations around distant stars. They look for what are called technosignatures, traces of technology written into light and matter. Things like excess infrared radiation that could indicate large-scale energy use, unusual chemical pollutants in exoplanet atmospheres, tiny periodic dips in starlight that suggest colossal structures circling a sun. The same toolkit could, in principle, uncover remnants of a civilization in our own neighborhood. If a group long before us altered a planet's atmosphere, carved unusual geometries into its surface, or moved many small bodies into orderly orbits, we might detect those changes today. But even close to home, there is already an archaeological record beginning to form, the shell of junk encircling Earth, defunct satellites, bits of rocket stages, paint chips, fragments of broken hardware. They all orbit above us in a man-made halo. To any future intelligent beings excavating our orbit, this swarm of debris will be the first clear evidence of our technological youth. Scale that up over 1 million years. What might the debris field of a much older spacefaring civilization look like? Perhaps it would have dispersed by now, its patterns smeared out by gravitational interactions and collisions. Or perhaps faint imprints would remain preferred orbital planes, unnatural clustering, odd distributions of metallic material. We tend to treat archaeology as something that looks backward. But in a way, it's a discipline of connection. It links now to then. Cosmic archaeology stretches that connection far out, tying our tiny present moment to the deep past, not just of Earth, but of the solar system and beyond. The instruments we use today weren't designed to find our own forgotten history, but they might still reveal it. Astronomers hunting for exoplanets are, in effect, scanning millions of star systems for anomalies. Engineers tracking space junk around Earth are mapping the first layer of our own off-world ruins. AI systems trained to spot oddities in sky surveys might be the first to recognize a shape that doesn't belong, a repeating pattern of light or motion that speaks of design. Beneath it all lies a quiet emotional truth. Our search for other minds is also a search for ourselves. When we ask, "Is anyone out there?" we're also asking, "Have we done this before? Is existence a one-off event or part of a larger cycle?" One day, a future astronomer, or a machine descendant of ours, may find something small but decisive. An alloy fragment in lunar regolith with impossible age, a cavity in an asteroid whose geometry screams architecture, a long silent probe in a deep orbit, still holding a pattern in its circuits. The moment we recognize such a thing as deliberate, the loop will close slightly. We'll understand that our urge to explore and build is itself part of a lineage of exploration. That the first archaeologists of the cosmos were not us, but those who left before us. And that what we are doing now, cataloging, measuring, reaching outward, is a continuation of their work. Their story may already be written across the sky, etched into orbits and spectra, waiting for us to learn how to read it. When we finally do, when we find the equivalent of a handprint in the dust of another world, it might not shock us as much as we expect. It may feel strangely like remembering. We'll realize that the first civilization didn't vanish in the sense we feared. They diffused. They became part of the architecture of space itself. They're the reason we're listening, the reason we're searching, the reason the question who came before us feels so natural to ask. And as our instruments push outward and our data sets grow, perhaps we're not only detecting others, perhaps we are, in some faint way, responding to an invitation that has been lingering in the quiet for a very long time. A subtle message from the original explorers to those who would follow, saying simply, "Keep looking." Somewhere beyond planets and scattered light, the remnants of their journey are still drifting, patient, silent, persistent, waiting for us to remember that what we call the unknown may, in fact, be our oldest home. Imagine standing on a shoreline so old that even the shapes of the continents feel unfamiliar. The sea in front of you is filled with creatures no human eye has ever seen. The sky is darker, the stars more piercing, the air heavy with volcanic scents and the breath of unfamiliar forests. Somewhere out beyond that horizon, maybe thousands of years into their own story, an earlier civilization looks upward and begins to wonder where they will go next. They've mapped and mastered their world. They understand their planet's systems. They've watched its cycles repeat. Their main question is no longer, how do we survive? But how do we continue? Once you've learned nearly everything your home can teach, what comes after? When we think about where to go, we start with the obvious. The moon, Mars, then the outer planets and their moons. But for them, those places might not have been distant fantasies. They could have been familiar milestone steps on a long stairway they'd already begun to climb. The moon would have been the first natural target. It's close enough to dominate the sky, large and bright enough to stir endless curiosity. From its surface, they would have seen their home hanging in blackness, a luminous globe, rising over the gray horizon. That sight alone could have changed them. Its vacuum, stillness, and stability would make the moon a perfect testing ground. A place to practice living off-world. A staging area for further journeys. A haven. Or perhaps a vault. If they built anything there and then left, those structures might still exist, softened by dust, but not erased. Every centimeter of lunar soil is a slow time capsule. Tiny impacts churn and sprinkle, but rarely obliterate. A base, a shelter, even buried containers or equipment could persist, layered beneath ages of fine dust. To us, it would look like subtle geometric bumps or faint anomalies easily missed by distant scanners. After mastering their nearby companion, Mars would have beckoned. A planet with a real day-night cycle, an atmosphere, polar ice, and ancient watercourses carved into its surface. Mars may once have been more Earth-like than it is today, with thicker air and liquid water flowing freely. To them, it might have felt like a faded cousin colder, drier, but inviting. They could have chosen to nudge it back toward warmth. Maybe they altered its atmosphere, darkened its poles, seeded its soil with hardy microbes capable of slowly rebuilding a biosphere. If that happened, the evidence wouldn't be obvious ruins, but odd signatures. Chemical imbalances that don't fit geological expectations, organic compounds in places where they shouldn't naturally arise, or even fossil remnants of organisms with puzzling features. Our modern rovers might already have rolled past such clues without recognizing them for what they are. To a civilization used to spaceflight, turning Mars into a habitable outpost may not have been harder than building a network of cities. It would simply have required time and patience qualities a species thinking in tens of thousands of years might fully possess. Beyond Mars, the asteroid belt would have represented both a challenge and a treasure. Instead of one solid world, it's a scattered archipelago of resources, rich veins of metal, pockets of water ice, low gravity everywhere. For a people who knew how to live in space, the belt would be a natural industrial frontier. They could have hollowed out the largest bodies, turning them into spinning habitats with artificial gravity. Imagine the interior of a once solid asteroid transformed into a vast, rotating cylinder lined with fields and forests, lit by engineered suns at its center. From the outside, it would look like nothing but a rock. Only precise measurements of its mass, structure, and perhaps internal echoes would reveal its transformation. Over time, some of those habitats might have been abandoned. Their lights dimmed, their ecosystems collapsed or deliberately shut down. Collisions and micro-impacts would gradually wreck their interiors. Eventually, to crude observation, they would seem like ordinary battered asteroids again. Past the belt, the giant planets and their moons would have offered new kinds of opportunity. You can't land on Jupiter or Saturn in any straightforward way, but their moons are another matter. Europa, with its deep ice shell and likely ocean beneath. Ganymede and Callisto with their mixed rock and ice composition. Titan with its thick atmosphere and liquid hydrocarbon lakes. Enceladus, spraying salty plumes from an underground sea. These moons are natural laboratories, stable, shielded, rich in chemistry. A spacefaring civilization with mastery of biology might not need to bend them to Earth-like standards. Instead, they could adapt themselves, or their creations, to those worlds. they might have developed organisms that swim in frigid methane on Titan, or bask in the faint, filtered starlight beneath Europa's ice. They might have learned to live in subterranean oceans, in pressurized caverns, or in atmospheric platforms floating above giant planets' clouds. In doing so, they themselves would have changed. Their descendants on those moons might have looked and thought very differently from their ancestors who walked on Earth. Not less human in origin, but far removed from the original pattern. Farther out still, beyond Neptune, we reach the Kuiper Belt, an icy region filled with dwarf planets and frozen debris. This is the boundary between the familiar solar system and deep interstellar space. Light from the sun is faint there. Shadows are long. Orbits are slow and grave. For a patient civilization, that region might have been ideal for long-duration outposts. Structures anchored to Kuiper objects could remain stable for immense time spans. Metal corrodes slowly in such cold. Energy demands are low. If you wanted to build a place to sleep, to wait, or to store things for ages, this would be a good neighborhood. Still beyond that lies the imagined sphere of the Oort cloud, a vast, diffuse halo of icy bodies orbiting at staggering distances. These objects are far apart, but taken together, they form a natural lattice stretching halfway to the nearest stars. A species with enough time could hop from one to the next, using them as way stations, fuel depots, or gravitational stepping stones. If the first civilization chose to leave the solar system entirely, they might have done it this way, not by blazing a single straight path out, but by migrating along these frozen beads of matter, gathering momentum little by little, extending their reach until the sun's gravity loosened its hold and other stars began to tug. Once they stepped into interstellar space proper, their options multiplied. The nearest stars, Proxima Centauri, Alpha Centauri, Barnard's star, are unimaginably far by our current standards, but for a people used to sleeping across centuries, such distances would be manageable. They could cruise slowly, conserving energy, letting the dark carry them. Even if their ships took tens of thousands of years to arrive, that might not have bothered them. On those timescales, the difference between 100 and 1,000 years blurs. Upon entering other star systems, they might have looked for planets with specific qualities, liquid solvents, stable orbits, calm stars. Or they might have been more flexible, learning to inhabit whatever they found by adjusting themselves, their machines, or their companion life forms. Settling wouldn't necessarily mean replicating Earth. It might mean accepting profound changes. Some exoplanets we've detected already show odd traits. Atmospheres that seem too balanced, orbital patterns that suggest shepherding, unusual temperature profiles. Most of these features will likely have conventional explanations, but a few might eventually resist all natural explanations and point toward engineering echoes of someone having been there long ago. If the first civilization moved out like this, gradually, then over millions of years they could have spread through significant portions of the galaxy, not as conquerors claiming territory, but as a diffused culture adjusting to new conditions, splitting into branches, merging with other life where they found it. Along the way, they would have faced choices about identity, how much of their original form to preserve, how much to allow themselves to change. At some point, physical form might have become flexible, or even optional. They could choose bodies suited to plasma clouds, dense atmospheres, low gravity, high radiation. They might not even inhabit bodies, in any sense we'd instantly recognize. There's also the possibility that after a certain point, they abandon physical travel almost entirely. Once you can turn consciousness into information patterns that can be encoded, transmitted, and reconstructed, the game changes. You might no longer need starships in the classic sense. You could send yourself as pulses of energy, riding light waves or other carriers. Those pulses would journey at light speed, spreading across the galaxy as signals. Some might be captured by prepared receivers and reassembled into minds. Others might wander indefinitely, embedded in background noise, waiting for some future intelligence to decode them by accident. If they mastered that, then at least some fraction of their civilization might already be everywhere light can go. In that picture, we're not waiting for them to arrive. We're immersed in their presence without recognizing it. However they traveled slow ships, frozen arcs, data beams, the further they went, the less they would resemble the beings who first left Earth. After long stretches of time, they might not even think of themselves as from a particular planet. Their origin would become a distant fact, like our knowledge that our atoms were forged in ancient stars. And yet the pattern of their journey would remain. Exploration, adaptation, reflection, perhaps mentorship. At some point they might have met others. The galaxy is old. We likely are not the first or the only. Their path could have intersected with civilizations younger or older, thriving or declining. They might have learned from them, traded knowledge, or joined them in shared projects. They might even have become gardeners at a grander scale, helping new life take root on barren worlds, seeding simple organisms in promising places, or intervening gently to preserve developing biospheres from catastrophic events. In that light, the galaxy becomes less a cold, indifferent sea and more a patchwork of long-running experiments in consciousness and life. Worlds at different stages, species at different levels of awareness, travelers like them moving quietly among them, not to rule, but to assist. Somewhere within that web, they may have maintained something like a library, a place or network dedicated to memory, a vault of histories, sciences, art, and philosophy. Not static shelves, but a living system, evolving with every new contact and contribution. A storehouse of accumulated perspective, updated across millions of years. If such a library exists, it might not be on any physical world. It could be distributed, encoded in fields, or woven into the structure of space-time. Or it might actually be hidden in plain sight, in the laws of physics themselves, in the constants and ratios we keep discovering but don't fully understand. When physicists find the same mathematical patterns repeating at very different scales, from quantum fluctuations to galaxy clusters, it's tempting to think we're glimpsing some underlying design principle. What if that design is partly the result of choices made by earlier intelligences, operating with tools we can't yet imagine? We often think of the universe as a fixed backdrop in which life occasionally appears. But it might be that the universe we see, the one that's so oddly hospitable to complex structures, is already a second-generation or third-generation system. Tuned, modified, refined over unimaginable cycles by beings who learned how to write not on planets, but in the fabric of reality itself. If so, the first civilization that left Earth was participating in something far larger than its own survival story. It was joining a tradition of cosmic engineering and stewardship, becoming both a child and a contributor to an evolving universe. When we look up at the sky and feel that mix of wonder and homesickness, maybe we're catching a faint echo of the direction they took, a direction we're slowly aligning with on our own. Our rockets and probes are tiny compared to the vastness. Our reach is short, but direction matters. And if we're pointed along the same trajectory they once followed, then we're already on their path, retracing steps we don't remember taking. Somewhere ahead along that path they might still be traveling, slowly, steadily, changing and being changed. And if, one distant day, our descendants finally cross their wake, the reunion may not feel like meeting strangers at all. It may feel like recognizing a branch of family that left home a very long time ago. In that sense, they didn't really leave us behind. They left a map, not on paper or stone, but inside us, written as an orientation. Outward, upward, forward. A map made of curiosity and awe, pointing us toward the same deep currents of the galaxy they once entered. And as we follow those currents, each new star system we glimpse, each exoplanet we catalog, each distant light we decode, brings us a little closer to understanding not only where they went, but who we might become when we finally join them. Picture a vessel gliding through interstellar darkness, silent, unhurried, as patient as ice forming on a still lake. It isn't racing anywhere. It follows a path measured not in days or even years, but in centuries. Inside, there's almost no motion beyond what's required to keep it alive. No roaring engines, no flashing lights announcing its presence. Just a steady, enduring calm. If the first civilization truly abandoned Earth, maybe this is how they chose to cross the void. not by brute force and speed, but by settling into the slow rhythm of the cosmos itself. The distances between stars are immense, but distance is only impossible if you insist on haste. We're used to thinking of space travel as something loud and violent, metal shells, burning fuel, intense heat. But a civilization older, more attuned, might have seen all that as a crude first step, like early steam engines compared to quiet electric motors. They might have realized that the real key to reaching the stars wasn't to fight time, but to cooperate with it. Instead of trying to outrun the vastness, they would have learned to sleep through it. Nature already offers countless examples of deep rest as a survival strategy. Seeds lying dormant in deserts for decades waiting for rain. Microbes frozen in polar ice awakening after tens of thousands of years. Creatures that slow their heartbeat to almost nothing through winters or droughts. Evolution has been experimenting with suspension for eons. A civilization that mastered biology and physics might have expanded that instinct. Not just to survive a single season, but to span epochs. They could have developed techniques to slow metabolism to a whisper, or to pause it almost entirely. Cells held in perfect balance. Aging nearly stopped, processes deferred. Their ships then would be less like vehicles and more like drifting ecosystem self-contained worlds with forests, water cycles, and intricate life webs, all tuned toward extreme stability. Power would come not from explosive thrust, but from subtle interactions. Solar sails capturing starlight, gentle gravity assists, minimal course corrections executed over lifetimes. Inside, the travelers might have slept in a way we barely understand the word. Not a nightly rest, but a deep, orchestrated stillness, bodies preserved, minds suspended or turned inward. Perhaps their consciousness continued to function in shared dreamscapes, bound together in virtual worlds or collective inner experiences while the physical universe outside crept by. To them, centuries of travel might pass like a single, long, lucid dream. Such ships, if they exist, could be out there right now, drifting unnoticed. They'd reflect only faint starlight, radiate little heat, and emit almost no signal. To our current instruments, they could easily appear indistinguishable from natural debris, dark rocks, shards of ice, cold lumps of metal. Inside, life might be waiting, paused, not dead. There's another possibility. Instead of carrying whole bodies through space, they might have learned to store minds as data-patterned energy, magnetic arrangements, quantum states. In that scenario, the vessels cross the stars carrying coded identities, a library of beings encoded in memory banks, ready to be reconstituted when conditions are right. Such a ship wouldn't have to worry about biological decay. It could travel for millions of years, provided its hardware remained intact or self-repairing. It might sleep in long stretches, waking only periodically to check its course, harvest energy, and verify its stored contents. From the perspective of the encoded minds, no time would pass at all. They could shut their awareness off before launch and awaken near a new star, as if stepping through a door. It's even possible they wouldn't need physical ships in the familiar sense. Once you can represent a mind as information, you can broadcast it. They might have chosen to send themselves as streams of radiation-tight beams of light, neutrinos or gravitational ripples, carrying compressed identity patterns. Reception stations in other star systems could catch those beams and unpack them into new bodies or entirely different physical frameworks. In that vision, the long sleep between stars isn't aboard a craft at all. It's the quiet interval while a pattern of information travels at light speed, woven into the background flux of the universe. We already know that light from distant galaxies travels across billions of years, largely unchanged until it reaches us. Theoretically, information could ride along that same path. A civilization that learned how to reliably encode and decode such signals would, in a sense, transcend the usual constraints of distance. Of course, they might have combined all these methods. Some members traveling embodied, others stored digitally, others already transitioned into states we don't yet recognize as life. Their diaspora would be a complex tapestry of forms and strategies, all anchored in one underlying principle: patience. We assume that crossing the galaxy requires unimaginable power, but the deeper truth might be that it requires unimaginable calm. Our own spacecraft already echo this rhythm in a primitive way. The Voyager probes drift through interstellar space now, their instruments gradually dimming, their power slowly dwindling. They're tiny, fragile, and uninhabited, but they carry our sounds, images, and languages. They're asleep in their way, gliding through the dark, waiting for someone to notice. Scale that concept up by orders of magnitude. Fuse it with advanced biological and informational science, and you begin to glimpse what a truly interstellar civilization might look like on the move. Not fleets of roaring warships, but a few scattered hardy seeds, each one capable of blooming into a culture when it finds fertile ground. If one of those seed ships ever arrived at a new star system, awakening would be profound. Imagine opening your eyes after what feels like a moment, only to find a different sun overhead, a new configuration of constellations, an alien world turning slowly below. The act of stepping out onto that world's surface would carry the weight of entire histories. Maybe that was part of their design. The journey wasn't just about reaching new places, but about transforming those who traveled through time, through sleep, through discontinuity. Each arrival would feel like a fresh beginning, even for minds older than any single planet. Over millennia, many such ships might have launched. Some would fail, lost to collisions or unforeseen phenomena. Others would sail on, their cargo intact. Some might have landed, found hospitable worlds, awakened, and built new societies. Others might still be out there, frozen in their quiet passage, waiting to complete voyages they began before our species had language. And if we ever encountered one of those craft half buried in ice, dormant in a cold orbit, its systems flickering faintly, it might still contain sleeping minds, beings from our deepest past, or from a branch of our lineage that left earlier than we remember. The ethics of such a discovery would be staggering. Do we wake them? Observe them? Learn from them? Are they us? Or are they already something else? In the far future, we ourselves might do what they did. We might build slow, enduring ships not meant for us, but for descendants we'll never meet. We might load them with cultures, genomes, art, and potential, then send them drifting into the dark with no guarantee of destination. Trusting, as trees trust the wind with their seeds, that some will land where life can grow. It's a kind of faith. In time, in physics, in the stubbornness of life. The long sleep between stars begins to look less like an obstacle and more like a bridge, a natural, necessary stillness between breaths. Planets are the inhalations, bursts of activity, complexity, story. The journeys between them are the exhalations, rest, diffusion, waiting. Perhaps the first civilization understood this cosmic respiration. They aligned their travels with it, becoming part of a larger rhythm. Awaken, build, depart, sleep, arrive, awaken again. If they are still out there scattered across the galaxy, some awake, some in transit, some transformed into forms we can't even describe, then every signal we send might be brushing against their edges. Our radio waves, radar pings, and deep space broadcasts could be faint taps on the hulls of ancient ships or on the boundaries of their networks. Maybe some of our signals have already reached them. Maybe something in those deep, quiet vessels stirred at the touch, a slight fluctuation, a process reactivating, a small adjustment in a pre-planned timeline. Our existence might be the alarm clock for ships launched long before our written records began. When we imagine the universe as empty and silent, we project our short attention span onto it. But emptiness may simply be long-duration waiting, and silence may be full of listeners, sleepers, and travelers whose ways of being do not rely on noise. So, when the first civilization set out from Earth, they may not have roared into the cosmos as conquering heroes. They may have drifted outward like dandelion seeds, trusting the deep currents between stars to carry them. Some of those seeds might have rooted in other skies. Some might still be floating. And some, perhaps, are once again near enough to hear us. If and when that mutual recognition finally happens, if we one day cross paths with ships or beings that once called this world home, it won't feel like the beginning of our story or the end. It will feel like a continuation, like waking from a shared dream and realizing someone else has been dreaming alongside us the whole time. Their journey through long sleep and darkness, and ours through history and myth, will have always been part of the same unfolding narrative. Different chapters, same book. And the dark between the stars, it won't look empty anymore. It will look like the necessary space between breaths, a pause long enough for civilizations to cross time, to become something new, and to meet again.